first learned about Confucius through jokes. Confucius says, to make an egg roll, one must push it downhill. They were corny little truisms meant to emulate the style of the Analects. But the man behind the joke is certainly the most influential philosopher in Chinese history, and arguably the most influential single thinker in the history of East Asia. His ideas shaped Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years, and I think they're still relevant today. Last week, I introduced the concept of the axial age, that window between 800 and 200 BCE, when human beings started reasoning about things like how to live and what a good life should look like. The Buddha, we saw, was one voice. Confucius is another. Born roughly a generation later, on the other side of the Himalayas, with no knowledge of either India or Greece. Confucius does not begin with the individual soul, like the way Aristotle does. He does not begin with the suffering of the isolated self, the way the Buddha does. Confucius begins where most of us, I think, actually live, with our families and our friends. Welcome back to American Socrates. I'm Matt Rupert. So to start off, I thought we should take a look at the man behind the philosophy here. Kong Chu, whom we know by the Latinized name Confucius, which is a rendering of Kong Fuzi, meaning Master Kong, is generally thought to be born around the year 551 BCE in a small feudal state in the province of Lu. It's now Shandong province in northeast China. His family had once been aristocratic, but by the time of his birth, they had fallen so far that his father had died when Confucius was 3 years old, leaving him and his mother in complete poverty. Confucius had to educate himself, and he did so with a ferocious set of discipline. He mastered the 6 arts that constituted the educated gentleman's curriculum of his day, which were ritual, music, archery, charioteering, writing, and mathematics. And then he started teaching. He took on students of any background, as long as they could pay a modest fee. That was, at the time, a rather radical democratization of education. It was new in China, where the idea of education had always been the exclusive province of the elites. So in many regards, Confucius is the opposite of the Buddha here. Rather than being born into a sheltered life in a magnificent palace, Confucius started at the bottom. He started already in poverty and had to work really hard to try and get himself out of it. But he had no support. There was no real hope of success that the Buddha had. He could always have gone back to his mom and dad if things had gotten too hard. Confucius had to make it on his own. And so if he was going to succeed, it was going to be by learning and through the cultivation of his character. The China that Confucius lived in was not a place at peace either. The Zhou dynasty, which had unified China under a common cultural order, had begun to fragment into dozens of smaller competing feudal states. Warlords ruled by force at this time. Corruption was extremely rampant. The old rituals and social structures that had held communities together for such a long time were being abandoned or outright mocked as unnecessary or even foolish. The people in general were asking questions like, if the old order is gone, what is supposed to keep us together now? And the answer that they got all too often was nothing. Nothing keeps us together. It's just force or power. And if your warlord doesn't have that kind of power, then you're not going to be unified. Confucius spent his life thinking about this problem. And it should be noted that this is not an abstract philosophical question he is dealing with here. It's the question of every society in a moment of crisis. And I think it's the same question that Americans have been asking, in their multiple ways for maybe the last 2 decades. When our institutions begin to fail us, when trust among the people begins to collapse, you don't trust your neighbor, you don't trust your fellow American anymore. When the common culture and our common identity begins to fracture into smaller subgroups, what do we have left to unite us under? Confucius offers an answer. He said that we have our connections to each other. We have our relationships. And the question is whether we will inhabit them with integrity or simply abandon them for our own personal advantage. Think of the way that people are dragons online and rather mild-mannered in real life. That's because online is generally devoid of real relationships. Real life is laden with them. If you're a political zealot online, the consequences of your zealotry matter very little. But in real life, you're apt to upset a lot of people that you care about and a lot of people that you depend on. And this is true, of course, until you switch over to only associating with people who believe and think just like yourself, when you can no longer tolerate the opinions of anybody who doesn't already believe what you believe. And that's something that Confucius had seemingly picked up on already. Confucius spent years traveling from state to state, offering his services as a political advisor, trying to find a ruler who would actually govern by the ethical principles that he was developing. He had brief moments of apparent success. He got a position as a minister of justice in Lu, but he was repeatedly pushed out by the politicians who found his insistence on moral integrity inconvenient to their ambitions. It became dangerous to speak the truth to these people because they kind of wanted yes men. They wanted advisors who would tell them that whatever they wanted to do was the right thing to do. And so he eventually returned home and spent his final years just teaching students generally. He died in 479 BCE, in his early 70s, convinced that his life's work had come to nothing. His students, however, gathered around him and mourned him deeply. And then, crucially, they began writing down everything that he had said and taught to them. The result is what we call the Analects. It's a collection of conversations and sayings and moments that reads less like a philosophical treatise and more like spending time with some very wise, occasionally impatient, but deeply human teacher. The Analects begins like this. Is it not pleasant to learn with a constant perseverance and practice? Is it not delightful to have friends coming from distant quarters? The Analytics is not a list of commandments or even a list of theories, but a series of questions that really invite a conversation among friends to come and to learn together. Confucius begins, as I think Socrates really begins, by asking you to think alongside him and see if there isn't something true to what he is saying. There's a lot of parallels between them, in fact. Both he and Socrates started in poverty. Both taught through conversation. Both wrote nothing themselves. Both were preserved by devoted students. Both became the fountainhead of vast philosophical traditions. And both, in their different ways, were inconvenient to the people and power around them. Neither struck it rich, and neither of them were successful by common measures in their lifetimes. But both achieved such a respect for their ideas that people have bothered to pass them on, down, over the generations, for the last 2,000 years. Okay, so what did Confucius actually say? The Analects is not a systematic treatise, I said that. It's a collection of fragments rather than a single, guidebook. It's short exchanges here and there, aphorisms, stories about what Confucius did in various situations, generally when he was talking with his students. But to understand it, you need to know the four concepts that scholars have identified in an attempt to organize the whole. The first concept is something called Ren. Ren is pretty much the master concept in Confucius's ethics. It's the one that runs through all of it. Ren is usually translated as something like benevolence or humanness, or maybe even as goodness, but none of those actually quite captures what it means. You could think of it as the full measure of what it means to treat other human beings as human beings, with genuine care and attention and respect being paid to each and every one of them. Most of the time, we just use each other for what we can get out of each other. Labor, services, money, sex, companionship. These are sometimes necessary relationships, but they are certainly not Ren. It's best thought of as a principle of generosity to other humans, even when you don't know them or have found their character to be lacking somehow. We don't just have to respect our equals or our superiors, we have to respect our inferiors if we're going to embody this concept of Ren. Before Confucius, the word Ren actually referred to the noble bearing of an aristocrat. Like it was a quality of the bloodline and of class. Like this is a good person. It's kind of like the word gentle in English, originally referred to a class of feudal society, but now it means something more like a character trait. Confucius had stripped away the class connotation of Ren entirely here. Ren is a moral excellence to anyone, any person of any background has the potential to achieve. So you're not born into Ren because your parents were rich or royalty. You could be born into absolute poverty and achieve Ren. You cultivate it, or you don't. Confucius expressed Ren most concisely in what scholars call the Silver Rule, not to be confused with what I have called the Silver Rule in previous episodes, which was do unto others exactly what they did unto you. The Silver Rule in Confucius is do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. Confucius's Silver Rule, then, is sort of a negative form of the more familiar Golden Rule of Christianity. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Here, Confucius is in China in 5th century BCE, arriving at relatively the same moral insight that we see in Leviticus, that we see with Jesus Christ, and virtually every other major ethical tradition that's ever been articulated. That's probably not a coincidence, then, that human reasoning is carefully pointing at something about human nature. It's a suggestion about what it takes to live with other human beings. We're going to have to treat them as though they were extensions of ourself. But the whole point here is that if you doubt Confucian ethics on some sense of Christian principle, I'm a Christian, so I don't believe in that, you would be doubting the same rules of Christianity, the Golden Rule. The second concept I want to look at is the concept of Li, which is the one I suspect will puzzle most of my modern Western audience. Li is usually translated as rituals or rites or proprietary, and that it makes it sound kind of formal, like a form of etiquette maybe, or, table manners or bureaucratic protocol. But I don't think that's exactly what Confucius means by the concept of Li here. Try to think of Li as the entire body of inherited social practices that have simply come down to you through your whole set of life experiences. All the ceremonies that you've ever seen, the birthday parties, the little courtesies that people do for each other, the customs of daily life. Those are the protocols of work and business and family. These are the things that structure our lives. Those structures, as arbitrary as they are how human beings live together with a sense of dignity and a sense of respect for each other. It includes everything from how you greet an elder to how a community buries its dead. So these are not arbitrary impositions. They are the accumulated wisdom of generations about how we are going to navigate as a people the moments of our lives, the moments that matter most. Things like birth and death and marriage and loyalty and loss and celebration. Even things like meals and hospitality. Virtually everything that matters to us. The key insight of Li is when you perform these rituals correctly and with genuine feeling, you're training yourself through the body and through practices to actually become the person the ritual expresses. The son who bows respectfully to his aging father, even when he doesn't feel like it, is practicing the habit of reverence until reverence becomes genuine. You can still revere your father even when you're mad at him because he's doing something foolish. It might feel a little silly, like you're being hypocritical or merely going through the motions, but that's only because you don't quite understand. And so you can't embody the spirit of the ritual the way it's meant to convey yet. Aristotle, you might recall, says something like this himself about habituation. You don't wait for the courageous feeling before you act brave. You have to act brave until you start to feel that you are courageous, and then you become a courageous person. For Confucius, Li is the specific practice through which Ren, our genuine humanness, gets built. It builds it into the person, layer by layer, through years of paying attention to it and sustained effort. You complete the rituals because you want to respect and treat people rightly. These rituals are not just going through the motions then. They are actually incredibly important. Think about a family that insists on eating dinner together. Even when everyone's busy and they're distracted and everyone would rather be doing something else, they just want to have a quick meal and go on about their day, get back to their phones or whatever. The ritual, the gathering, the sharing of the food, the conversation that happens around the table does something over time that no single meal actually accomplishes. It builds a family. That's the idea of li. The third concept here is yi, which means doing what is right because it's right. It's not for a reward. It's not for a reputation. It's not because someone is watching over you. It's the virtue of acting from moral integrity rather than a self-interested calculation. Confucius draws a sharp line between the junzi, which is the exemplary person who acts from a sense of yi, and the petty person who acts from a sense of profit. So this is one of the most repeated contrasts you see in the Analects. The exemplary person understands righteousness. The petty person understands profit. We live in a culture that tells us constantly that rational self-interest is the basis of all human motivation, and that we can socially leverage that so that everyone acting for personal advantage ultimately leads us to the greatest social moral goodness. And that anyone who claims otherwise is being either naive or simply lying. They're trying to steal stuff from you because they're socialists or something. But Confucius actually disagrees. He says that that's not right. There is a kind of person who has cultivated the capacity to act from what is right, not from what benefits them alone. That person is not only possible, that person is what we should be aiming to become, and our society should be trying to build more and more people like that. Which leads us exactly to the next concept, which is the junzi itself. The junzi is Confucius's portrait of what a fully developed human being would look like. The word originally meant a prince's son, someone born into the nobility. But Confucius, again, transforms it to mean someone who has cultivated a nobility of their character, regardless of what rank they were born into. So it's sometimes translated as gentleman, but that carries, again, a lot of class connotation in English. Although it does have a sort of similar etymological shift. Like I said, gentle meaning noble born in Middle English had shifted by the 13th century to mean something like the behavior of being gentle, how the highborn were expected to behave. A gentleman then was no longer simply the son of a lord or a duke, but a person who acts with courtesy, with honor, with nobility. They're an exemplary person is perhaps then the best translation for junzi as Confucius means it. Someone who simply has a life that is worth emulating. The junzi then embody ren and li and yi in an integrated way. But crucially, the junzi is not a privately virtuous person. The junzi's virtue is social. It changes the people around them, not through force or even through direct persuasion, but by example. In the Analects, he writes, "The moral force of the profound person is like the wind. The moral force of the small person is like the grass. Let the wind blow over the grass, and it is sure to bend." This is a theory of moral leadership, then, that doesn't depend on authority or wealth or office or position. The person who has genuinely cultivated their character becomes a center of moral gravity in whatever community they end up inhabiting. People are drawn to them. They're shaped simply by being in proximity to them. They can't help themselves any more than the grass can stand up against the wind. Parents know this about their children. Teachers know this about their students. Anyone who has worked alongside someone of genuine integrity knows this. The political implication then is that the junzi who serves a ruler will never serve them as a yes man. They're genuinely loyal, meaning that they have the courage to tell the ruler what he or she needs to hear, even when that is unwelcome, especially when it's unwelcome. The minister who stays silent when a ruler acts unjustly is not being a loyal minister. they're failing at their role. They owe it to their leader to tell them the truth. Confucius was repeatedly dismissed from positions of power precisely because of this, remember? But on the flip side, the ruler, if they don't like being lied to, has an obligation to their ministers to hear them out judiciously. In short, any person who uses religion or tradition or government or some other social role to justify complicity in injustice, say like a minister who stays silent or the soldier who follows unjust orders, in Confucian terms, are failings of character. The social, relational framework of morality demands more of us. We have to live up to the roles and obligations we owe to other people. That idea, then, that we owe things to other people in our society is probably what most clearly distinguishes Confucian ethics from anything else that I've covered. But it's a little confusing, especially if you're raised in Western, more individualist culture. So I want to set it up carefully, because once you hear it, you'll probably actually start to recognize something familiar in it. Or you may feel confused and attacked by it. I don't know. The central insight here is that you are your relationships. So let me start trying to explain that by going back to Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle asks, what kind of individual should you become? His ethics start with the individual soul and then works outwards from there towards your society. Other people matter, of course. Friendships are going to prove essential to having eudaimonia. But the primary unit of analysis is always the individual person. The individual is completely assumed here. You simply are, and then develop what you are through these practices. The Buddha asked similarly, how do I loosen the grip of cravings on myself and the ego that is fused to them? This sort of ethics starts again with suffering and works towards a disillusion of those things, but it starts with the individual. The boundary between the self and the other begins to soften as wisdom grows and you start to see yourself infused with everybody else or combined with everybody else. But it too starts from this individual perspective. I'm the one who's suffering. I see suffering in other people. What am I supposed to do? Confucius is going to start differently. He's going to say, how do I inhabit my relationships with integrity? His ethics doesn't start with the individual who then enters relationships with others. It starts with the relationships themselves, the roles that will be expected of us just by accident of our birth. And then how are we supposed to fulfill those roles respectfully and with dignity? You're not a self who has a father. You are, before you were a self, at least in part, someone's child. You had relationships before you were even born. And those relationships are more primary to you than either your rationality or your individuality. You are not a self who happens to have friends. You are, at least in part, constituted by those friendships. When you strip away every relationship, there is no you left in the Confucian sense. Identity is relational all the way down. So think of like balls tied to a string. We think of the balls as the real things. These are the nodes, and those are the things. The strings just link them. Then balls are primary. The balls are material. They are the individuals, and the strings are these abstract relationships. But we could simply reverse our thinking here, our understanding. We could think of the balls as merely the intersections of different strings. In this case, the strings are what are real. And if you look at that intersection of many strings, you begin to see how they lead to what someone would think of as an individual. You're the person who has these relationships with these different others, these sorts of roles. So communities where people still define themselves by their roles, where being good, a good father or a caring mother or a loyal spouse or a friend, a reliable coworker, a respectful child is the measure of a good person, Confucius is already operating in those people's lives. That is exactly the kind of philosophy he's talking about here. If you're a member of an American working class, this should not strike you as a foreign ideal then. You are familiar with the idea of living up to your obligations, living up to your social roles inside your family. You just didn't necessarily know that. Confucius, being a man of his times, lays out certain specific kinds of relationships, at least the ones he saw in his societies at the time. And like a man of his times, he was also tended to fall into the trap that we saw with Aristotle, where, men tend to dominate. It was very patriarchal. Families could be sometimes oppressive. These relationships like ruler and subject and parent and child and husband and wife and elder and younger sibling and friend with friend and things like that took on a much more formal role for Confucius. I don't know how much attention we want to pay to that. A lot of modern scholars don't necessarily try to build the culture around this ancient culture that Confucius was writing about. That's not the way we do things today. We still have roles and we still have obligations we need to fulfill, but they're different and they operate differently, and that's okay. One way you might want to think about these kinds of theories is they're like cherries. You eat the cherry, you enjoy the cherry, but you still spit out the pit. We don't eat the whole thing. And that is sort of the way I tend to treat like a lot of philosophers, is I look for the good parts and I throw out the bad parts. I don't have to swallow the whole thing. Next week, I want to turn back towards the West and I want to have a discussion about Christianity. And I'm even going to risk provoking some ubiquitous American culture war around religion by talking about why I think modern Christianity has kind of abandoned its own faith. But for now, I want to leave you with this question about these three axial age thinkers that we've talked about. All three of them have agreed that the good life is not something that simply happens to you. It's something that you build day by day, choice by choice, relationship by relationship. It is small work. It is shadow work. It's an inglorious kind of work that has to be performed daily. And so my question for you is to think of the kinds of relationships that define you right now. The ones you're most proud of. The ones that you most want to look away from. The ones that ultimately you failed in. The ones that you tell others about. Are you the person those relationships are calling you to be? And if you're not, what would it take to get you there? That's the kind of Confucian thinking that I think is the most beneficial to us today. It's a simple idea of what roles do I inhabit in my social life, and am I doing them well? Am I a real friend to my friends? Am I a real father to my children? Am I a real husband to my wife? So on and so forth. These are the questions that we've been asking for 2,500 years, and I don't think they've gotten any easier in all of that time. And they probably never will. But that doesn't mean that they are not worth it. Thanks for tuning in to American Socrates. If today's episode of Philosophy got you thinking in new ways, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. New, full episodes drop every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review. It helps others find us, and it means a lot. And if you know someone who could use a little more practical wisdom in their life, share this episode with them. Until next time, keep questioning everything.